After all that, let's get back to editing exposure and actually editing our photos. So below the white balance options, you have exposure. You have multiple sliders. One is for overall exposure, which is the brightness of the entire image. All parts of the image will become brighter or all parts will become darker. And that's a good way if your entire image is too bright or too dark to sort of adjust the exposure. You'll notice with this image, and this happens with most images, if you bring down the exposure, while parts of the image might look good, say we want the background to look darker or Sam's jacket to look darker, the other parts that we want to be exposed properly, it gets too dark. That's why we have sliders below that allow us to adjust the exposure of all of the individual exposures of the image. So this slider highlights will adjust just the highlights, just the bright parts. So if we want to bring up the highlights, we can bring up here. Say we want to bring up the shadows to get a little bit more detail in Sam's hair or in the jacket, we can adjust the shadow slider. The whites, these are the part of the image that are even brighter than the highlights. Maybe we want to bring that down. And this is usually where if something's slightly overexposed, by bringing down the whites, you can bring back some of that exposure and detail. Blacks, if you want to add contrast, you might want to bring down the blacks just slightly. You'll also notice this contrast slider. By increasing this, you add contrast. By decreasing this, you decrease contrast. Contrast is the ratio of dark to bright. And so by increasing the contrast, the darks get darker and the brights get brighter. By decreasing contrast, the brights get darker and the darks get brighter. You can see on this histogram up here at the top, which is a good thing to look at when you're adjusting exposure. You've got the darks on the left, the brights on the right. And if I take the overall exposure to the left, everything moves to the left. If I take it to the right, everything moves to the right. I'm going to double click that to reset that exposure level. Now with contrast, if I drag to the left, everything squeezes into the middle and becomes sort of all that mid-range exposure. If I go all the way to the right, everything sort of spreads out. The darks become darker, the brights become brighter. What we were doing down below with the highlights, shadows, blacks, and whites was also sort of adding contrast to this image. By bringing down the brights, by bringing up the highlights, you are creating contrast itself. The contrast slider is just one other way to do so. Cool, so that's how you adjust exposure, play around with these sliders with your own images or with some of the other sample images to practice getting proper exposure with all those photos and also to get creative with it. In the next lesson, we'll be looking at these color options.